Won't you tell me, baby, tell me, then I won't have to be playing around, playing around. Yeah, creeping around, oh baby, playing around. Living up, I can feel.
Ricki, I think it is about 6 o'clock, right on the nose. So I'm gonna keep admitting people here.
Okay.
But I say we go ahead and jump in. If you want to start, just introduce yourself. And, oh, hold on just a second. Not a DJ, I can tell you that. So there we go. All right, if you want to step in, just say hi. All that good
Let's see.
stuff.
I was gonna jump in with singing and let people know how in love I am with them. You stop by.
Hey, do what you do.
Hey.
Gibbs a second.
Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conversation 2, Examining Race in Education. My name is Ricki Gibbs, and I have the honor and privilege of serving at an elementary school here in Metro Nashville Public Schools. Tonight, we're going to dig into more race in education. We have two awesome panelists with us that will dig into some topics. We're going to have some of those uncomfortable conversations throughout the time. We're going to invite you all to use the chat box during this conversation. I'm going to be monitoring it, and we have some time set aside for audience questions. So if you have questions or if there's points that are made that you want to definitely circle back to, make sure that you put it in the chat box and we'll come back to it. Also, if you're on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, you know we roll with the hashtag Disruptors Unite. We are truly unapologetic disruptors in education, out to change the narrative of the work. So we thank you for being with us. I'll turn it over to Portell, and we're going to get this show rolling.
All right. So yeah, just like Dr. Gibbs said, really glad that you all are here. We just want to have conversations in all honesty. We've got two great people here that Ricki and I have had the pleasure of speaking to and working with, and I know Ingrid's been on my podcast, and we were talking prior to letting everybody in. She asked me a question that she may ask some of you, and it was something that's resonated with me, and I think it's time that we start having conversations about the impact of historical trauma, the impact of long-term transmission of trauma through the systems and structures that we have. So when Ricki and I were talking about this, I'm like, I know the person. He's like, and I know another person, Jeff, who's here tonight. And so we're just going to jump in, and we are going to have some time at the end, like Ricki said. But please use the chat box. If something resonates with you, put it in there. If you have a question, save it till the end, because we are going to have a question time. But just have that conversation going while the chat is also moving. We're going to start participating in that as well. So let's jump in. Ricki, you want to start us off with Jeff here?
Absolutely. Jeff, I feel like you're a man that needs no introduction. I would do you a disservice by actually doing a proper introduction. So I'm going to just turn the floor over to you and let you introduce yourself to everyone.
Hey, I appreciate it, Brother Gibbs, Dr. Gibbs, Brother Portell, being here with you guys, being here with everyone. Dr. Ingrid, your reputation precedes you. My name is Jeff Obafemi Carr. I am on the .UC, a community strategist and thought leader. That is one of the ways that I describe myself and the work that I do. But I'm first and foremost a family guy here in Nashville, Tennessee, and was born and raised here in the city. Went to Metro Public Schools, got expelled from Metro Public Schools, got readmitted to Metro Public Schools, and found myself at a public institution, Tennessee State University, where I finally got my act together. And once I got my act together and in line, I became a student leader. And in 1989-90, I was elected president of the Student Government Association, the student body there. And of course, in following with the disruption narrative tonight, I disrupted the campus by leading a 14-day sit-in with about 2,000 students, where we locked the administration out of their building, and went on a 14-day hunger strike because of inequities in higher education. It resulted rather, in $120 million being spent on Tennessee State. So if you've driven by Tennessee State since the mid-90s or went to school there, all of those buildings are there because of the sacrifice of a number of students who said, you know what, enough for inequity. So that set the tone for the rest of my life through the creative world. I'm an award-winning filmmaker. I'm an interfaith minister who works at the intersections of mental health and spiritual health, holistic health, community building and institution building. And I'm speaking to you from one of the institutions that I've been blessed to build, and that's the Infinity Center of the Infinity Fellowship in North Nashville. I'm excited to be here as a person who not only works in the community, but works with educational institutions, including metro schools back in the day, and currently a project that I'm doing with St. Louis Public Schools in connection with the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So all of that to say, I'm just happy to be here with everybody.
Ingrid, tell us about you. I know a lot about you, but I want everybody else to hear from you.
Well, first, I'm not a doctor, but my name is Ingrid Cockhren. I am, I do a lot of things, but for the most part, I am a college professor at Tennessee State University. I teach abnormal psych, developmental psychology, and psychology of the African American experience. I also am a part of a company called ACES Connection, which is out of California. And what we do is we are a social network that really brings together people who are interested in the adverse childhood experiences study and also becoming trauma informed. And I also consult. I help companies and nonprofits become trauma informed, and I do some DEI work. I think what really brought me to this place is, in part, the adverse childhood experiences study. When I was getting my master's here in Nashville, I was studying African American parenting practices and came across the adverse childhood experiences study back in 2010. But what actually brought me there was working with in an institution called Woodland Hills, which is here. Well, I think the name has changed, but it's here in Nashville, and it is a state facility that caters to children 12 to 18 who have committed 3 felonies, rape or murder. And while I was there, I encountered a lot of children, and I always wondered what their home life was like and how did they get to the point where they were incarcerated so young. And overwhelmingly, they were African American, 80% or so. It was both boys and girls. And so that really got me into the field of psychology. I went to TSU as well for undergrad and focused on incarceration. And then I thought, okay, I need to move towards prevention. So I went to Vanderbilt to focus on African American parenting practices because at that time I still had my white supremacist lens on. And I thought, well, this is a parenting issue, and so we need to be preventative and let me look into what's going on with African American parenting. And so quickly I fell down a research rabbit hole and learned about trauma. And then once I put on that trauma lens, I let go of the white supremacist lens, and I began to understand the intergenerational transmission of trauma, and thus really changed the narrative that I had around myself, my own Black identity, the identity of those children that I was interacting with at that facility. And it really opened up my eyes to how our country's history has created so much inequity in every way. And schools is one of those institutions where you can really see the inequities.
Perfect. So we're gonna get right into it. This first question is aimed at Jeff. Part of a conversation that we were having previously, we were just talking about the growth of Nashville, and if you've been in downtown Nashville, you see a new crane. There's a lot of conversation on gentrification. A lot of folks are having conversations about just the cost of living in Nashville. So Jeff, through your research, I know you've kind of looked at government structures and housing patterns. Discuss with us some of the impacts that housing patterns have on race and education.
That's good. It's good to bring that up too, because there's the research that's out there. Dr. Jerome Morris, who is a phenomenal resource. He is the E. Desmond Lee Endowed Chair Professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I work with him a lot, and he talks a lot about race and inequity in housing and how that determines your success factors based on where you live, based on where you go to school. That's where the money goes. And he talks about something that he calls in educational circles and economic circles, white currency. White currency is very, very powerful. There's an experiential story that I have. I grew up in a part of town that we call out South, but modern day people, after a lot of Columbusing, have renamed it 12th South. So now in 12th South, that's the neighborhood I grew up in the heart of. There was a school, a little school, it was a wonderfully diverse school, and I mean diverse in the traditional way that the world looks diverse, like a ton of colored people, some white people here, different cultures. It was like really a great mixing pot. And I went to kindergarten there. Somewhere between kindergarten and first grade, it was decided that they would need to close that school down. So as the neighborhood had become primarily African American, they closed Waverly Belmont down, shuttered the doors, turned it into a storage building and resource facility. Then they bused me 30 minutes and the other black kids out to Percy Priest Elementary. Of course, great school in a number of ways, but as we get into this, we can talk about the invisibility of being black in a predominantly white environment and how that is an educational ace or adverse childhood experience that we repetitively go through. Interestingly though, over the last 10 years, that entire neighborhood has become upscale, predominantly white, and guess what? Waverly Belmont has been reopened, renovated, and resourced as a neighborhood school. We see this pattern taking place all over the United States, particularly in urban areas. White folks come to the neighborhood, we get the infrastructure, we get the resources, we get the improvements. If it remains an African American neighborhood, we don't get it. This contributes to a de facto segregation, because technically we're past legal segregation, but it creates a de facto sense of segregation where we find ourselves battling for resources as parents, understanding that you have a negative or a positive educational experience based in Nashville particularly on what zip code you live in. That is one of the major inequities that we're facing in education. And that's one of the struggles that we have, my wife and I have. We have 5 kids, and all of them are MPS kids too. And every single year, we go through this crisis of consciousness between where's our zip code sending our kids to, and how can we protect them from having some of the adverse childhood experiences that we've had. So if you have the housing patterns that are still operating in that same way 100 years later, you just have the same educational problems happening in the schools.
Ingrid, and I know we talked about this, and for those people who are listening, we don't rehearse anything, so this really is a conversation. I know you and I dug into the impacts of the desegregation of schools, and you had some strong feelings about that. Will you talk about and I don't know if you remember the conversation, I do, but just what are your feelings about the original desegregations and the segregation, self-segregation now?
Well, it's a complex issue because throughout history, we have been sold this narrative that we should be integrated, and I'm not opposed to that. But what I will say is that desegregation had a host of consequences, and more importantly, the breakdown of Black business, the breakdown of the Black community being a safe haven and a stronghold, but also, before, when we were segregated, there were plenty of Black teachers. And a black male teacher was not exactly a unicorn. However, today you'll find that most of our teachers are white female, and so most of our children are being essentially raised, because after you get out of early childhood, your teachers are just as influential as your parents. And so, and this is somewhat problematic, one, in that there's a lot of bias, teacher bias within our schools. This is very well researched. This is not something that's limited to white teachers. There is white favored bias across our country in most of our population, including people of color. But when in the position of a teacher, someone who is very influential, and if that teacher sees your skin color as limiting, or as something that you would have to work around, or if they see you as they have lower expectations of you, and they only see you as your circumstance, then that is going to be problematic for all of those children who are in learning situations that are really, really being impacted by these low expectations, lack of attachment with their teachers, so the disconnect. And so that is something that has definitely been exacerbated since we have desegregated. So it's a complex issue. There were a lot of consequences for desegregation. And let's be honest, once Black children entered white schools, they entered a hostile environment. At that time, and still presently, there's still lingering impact of the segregation, of the integration of schools, and something that has never been dealt with. So we kind of transplanted children of color into white institutions without any type of real integration as far as the mindset that it would take to raise a whole child of color, to take into account racial identity development. And even now, as we have the psychology and the research behind these concepts, we're still not doing it.
Yeah, and I remember that's exactly what you were talking about. And it's not something I had really processed, but it is something that we do still feel the effects of. And I think even digging further, Ingrid, how has racial and historical trauma impacted communities over time? Now, we kind of addressed the desegregation, but really dig into the trauma, the adverse experience, not the study, but just trauma in general. How has that made its way to where we are right now?
So effectively, this has created two different worlds. It's created a world for people of color and a world for white people. And the process that's making this possible is called racial socialization. So how are we raising our children? One group is raising their children to take advantage of all of the benefits of America, to pursue, their life and liberty and freedom, right? And then other groups are really essentially preparing their children to either avoid racism or to deal with racism. They're grooming their children to be embedded into a racist system. And this requires that they either stress to their child that they have to work so much harder than white children, white students, or they stress to their child that, because they're Black, because of the color of their skin, they're not going to be afforded opportunities. They're going to be looked down upon. And then that child, and another layer is that survival layer. So they have to be fearful and wary of the police and authority, to include, and that authority could be their administrators, principals, teachers. And so this process of racial socialization is creating two worlds where children of color are taking on the burden of racism. They're being asked to adjust and adapt to racism by their parents. And on the other end, we have white children who are being passively racially socialized. So this means that the messages that they are seeing in their environment that's telling them white is better, that basically other groups who are not excelling or not experiencing the environment like white people are doing so not because of the color of their skin or because they're experiencing racism, but because they're making poor choices. They need to get a job. They need to live in a different neighborhood. And so this is how white children are being racially socialized. And this is creating a great divide in our country and the inability to connect in a real way.
So Ingrid, you hit on a couple points that I want to bring out to the audience. Obviously, you talked about the racial socialization, which is a very interesting concept. But you also hit on the black male educator at one point was not a unicorn. And that's something that all the educators that's on this call, we can all attest to, especially if you're in the elementary school. It's extremely rare to see that black male teacher, to the point that one of the conversations that we will have in this series is how do we do a better job of recruiting minority teachers, and especially if they're going into predominantly white schools, what can our white allies, our white colleagues do to help bring those folks into the fold to make them comfortable in those settings, because they have a responsibility to play in that as well. Jeff, I want to jump back to you. You hit on the fact that you led the student protests at Tennessee State, 14-day hunger strike. We have a lot of educators on this call. And one of the things we know right now at this point, where we are in our country, we have virtual learning coming. We have a lot of trauma that our boys and girls are experiencing. But we know this is a critical time that if we can bring that energy together, we can harness the power of student voice to really impact change. So my question to you, Jeff, as we dig into this concept, being someone that has been a student leader, how can we as educators empower our students to use their voice during this time to really impact change?
You know, that's an interesting point that you raised, Dr. Gibbs, because, and I'm going to give this before I even get going and deep down the rabbit hole in this. If everybody doesn't have their grown-up drawers on, this is time to put them on. If I'm talking to Gibbs and Portell, they're keeping it real. Sister Ingrid is keeping it real, so I'm just going to keep it real with everybody on here. You didn't get on here to just waste an hour. You got here to hear what's real. When we're talking honestly about these issues, we have to really talk about how we all are racially socialized toward white supremacy, because we all are. And our children are absolutely not any different than we are. I'll never forget one of the biggest debates that happened during the student sit-in 1990 was with the faculty. The administration was trying to get the faculty to side against the students. And Dr. Granberry, who was a phenomenal professor of psychology, she was one of my favorite professors, she stood up, man, and she started this monologue that ended in tears. And she said something that stuck with me for the rest of my life. She said, we are educators. We have sat here for 4 years with many of these kids, and we've taught them how to write. We've taught them how to express themselves. We've taught them how to stand up for themselves. We've taught them how to be strong human beings. What would it say for us to now turn on them and try to oppress them and suppress them and kill the very spirit that we tried to bring about in them? That was an HBCU experience for me, but it's also with our kids who are in metro schools. It's our kids who have been broken by generational trauma. If you read any of the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy, I always point to her. She has a great book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she talks about the research that shows that trauma actually changes our DNA. So that happens from one generation. What happens 40, 50 generations of trauma? How do we work that out? Trauma goes both ways though. You have the traumatized who are victims or survivors. I call it survivors of white supremacy. We have cognitive dissonance because society is teaching us that we are not human. Dick Gregory tells people, he says, I never taught my kids you have to work twice as hard, because when you're teaching some kids that you have to work twice as hard, you're telling them that they're twice as dumb. That's how kids receive that. That's how they hear that. We know that there was a loving environment in black schools and segregated schools where they were trying their best to give their kids a one-up. But that creates cognitive dissonance, because this myth that we are living in a meritocracy comes out when they grow up and they see the white guy next to them do half the work, do absolutely nothing, and ends up getting the keys to everything that he wants in society. The other side of that is with the white kids, because the white kids are growing in a space of privilege and entitlement where, in order to be successful, many times you have to contribute to the dehumanization of the black kids, which traumatizes your DNA. So we have to get to a point with an educational environment, coming back around to the answer to the question, we have to understand that it's our responsibility to grow greatness in every single child we see, to grow balance in every single child we see, and when they buck against us, when they don't agree with us, when they tell us what they want to see and what they want to feel, we can't get angry with that. We should take that as a compliment. Take it as a compliment that you have planted the right seed in a child, as opposed to a challenge. It's the challenge behavior that we see in a predominantly white schooling environment that transforms somewhere around 3rd and 4th grade the really cute, sassy little black girl with the nice, cool, fun attitude into somebody who's got a bad attitude. Or the black child who is confident and comes in and shakes hand and looks into the eye in the 4th grade as somebody who is a threat to that white teacher, particularly that white female teacher. When that starts to happen, we start to pass on the very generational trauma that we're all sitting here working to get rid of.
And I mean, what you're describing is what schools are trying to prepare. And I hear this all the time in the work that we are trying to do at my school. And I know Ricki is too. And I know many people are of, well, you're not preparing them for the real world. And when I hear that, it makes my skin crawl, because we don't need to prepare kids for the real world. We need to change the world in which we're preparing them for. In what you described, I don't know if y'all noticed, I'm a white guy, right? And it took me a while I grew up in a white community. I mean, to say this growth has been a journey is an understatement. And I talked about it on our first conversation about when I finally identified that I had projected so many stereotypes on the black community. And it happened when I did attend TSU. And I didn't understand that I had all of this supremacy in me by only not being exposed and understand a community, right? And it changed me. But we have educators, and I'll say I'm one of them, because we all have bias, you all. And if we say, and Ricki said it last time, we all have bias. It's just if we don't take the time to identify it is when the problem really begins. In identifying those bias, we all have to keep each other in check. And we have to keep all educators in check, because it's the system we have to disrupt. So Ingrid, how do you see right now in the state so that we're in right now? And to me, I think it's anytime there's a disruption, right, there's opportunity for growth. There's opportunity for us to come out better than we were. But there's also an opportunity to come out worse, or even what some people call worse is status quo, right? Coming back normalized. So what do you see as the role of race in education right now? What do you see we can do as educators, both white and black, and brown and indigenous? What can we all do right now as educators, and how do you see that role?
Yeah, so this collective trauma of this pandemic, I think for everyone, not even just education, this is a time to pause and re-examine the systems that we have set up in this country. And just to give a disclaimer, I have a 2-year-old and a big dog, so they'll be in the background. But we really need to just re-examine. A lot of the talk now is anti-racism, which is great. I think it's wonderful. I think that we, if we want to look at white identity development, that's a good place to start, because anti-racist is a I guess, a stage of white identity development. But the height of white identity development, according to Dr. Janet Helms, is autonomy. And this is where, white people are able to move throughout this racist system, create an understanding of what's going on around them, and then actively address social justice issues without relying on people of color. And this autonomy is what's needed. And the way that we get there is going to be through liberation. We are going to have to take advantage of this trauma-informed movement, right? Less punitive, and be more open and understanding, and address everyone as if they're coming from a situation of adversity. That's just the beginning. But beyond that, we have to examine whiteness, because so much of our efforts have been put into deficit research around people of color and trying to fix these children with our system. And the system is broken, and the system has been broken from its formation. It was only meant for white, wealthy families, and anyone outside of that would be crushed by the system, and that's effectively what's happening. And so we have to really re-envision whiteness. We have to examine whiteness. We have to say that racism is a defect of whiteness, and that all of these issues around racism and the racist system that has been set up is at its core due to white supremacy, which means that we can't keep the system the way it is. We would have to dismantle it. It's not going to be dismantled by people of color. It's going to be dismantled by white people. That's the only group that has the power to do it, but also that's the group that has the responsibility. We need to really change the narrative. Right now, the narrative is that people of color are damaged in some way. We don't know what has happened. It's the parenting, it's poverty, they're lazy, they don't want to work. I mean, all the different stereotypes. But the truth is that white people in this country have damaged people of color in this country. And that damage is manifesting in a way that's going to hurt all of us as a whole. It's going to jeopardize the future of your white children. Because as we are in this country together, as we go through collective trauma, as we move through our environment, if one of us is not well, then it's going to affect all of us. And this puts us all in jeopardy. And the longer that we try to hold on to this racist system and say that, we all have freedom and liberty, the more we're going to be able to see it fall apart. You're going to see Black people getting sick at higher rates from COVID. As we move forward, you're going to see all of those families that are essential and have essential workers. Or you're going to see that people who can't work during this time, they're going to fall into homelessness. And it's going to be a reflection on how we were unable to deal with our own racist system, that instead we just decided that we're fine with the way things are.
Jeff, I want to hear from you as well. What do you see as the role of race right now, and how do we shift systems? And I know you have you've got a great writing out right now that I want you to share with people about some recommendations here in Nashville that I think are super powerful, and I think they're significant.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to understand is we're not operating in society in America right now. We're not operating in a bubble of race. Race is American society. What we're seeing happen is, as Malcolm X said, that this case of the chickens, this concept of the chickens coming home to roost. There is this cognitive dissonance again with everything that's happening in America. People are angry, they're protesting. Protests are seen as negative from the people who loot or the people who destroy property. I pointed out in a conversation a couple of weeks ago of a time where store owners who sympathized, right, with the government, their stuff was torn down. Their buildings were set on fire. They were dragged out. They were beat up. People got so tired of them that they went and dumped property, tons of property into the bay. I'm talking about the Boston Tea Party. This is what started America. So when we look and we say, well, America now is here, we want people to have peaceful protests, and I point to that and I say, when was a protest ever peaceful for black people? Because if you go to the 60s and you see the blood and you see the dogs and you see the bombs, never once was there a space of peacefulness. I don't know if there is a proper place for protest that is acceptable to anyone. Kids are not dumb. This generation is not dumb. Everybody has the internet. Everybody has a new history, a perspective, because they don't just believe what they've been taught in school. So we see that America was built on coming, robbing indigenous people of their land, burning down what they need to burn down, fighting who they need to fight to have a sense of independence that is contradictory because the laws are written, the Constitution is written by people who felt comfortable enough owning other human beings. When we talk about going back to this concept of the American idea or the American ideal or making America great again, whatever the political slogan is, the question comes down the pipe. Was the country ever great for people of color, for indigenous people? Were we ever there? Or was it great enough for us to be in the background, quiet, with a towel over our arms? That became the template for America, and that is what we are working to systemically tear down. That is the framework. Let me say something about imagery because this is important. It might ruffle a few feathers. My wife and I are independent, and we have a ton of great things that we do, and the universe blesses us with income to do those partnerships. But during the Obama years, our kids had the greatest image they could ever have of systemic power. They grew up, our younger kids grew up in a space where when you say president, they think of President Obama, they think of First Lady Michelle, they think of the kids. That's great. Now, were they some of the worst years in terms of the wealth gap for black Americans? Absolutely they were. We did not get a lot of tangible things done. But the imagery alone was enough to give confidence to a new generation. It proves another point. If I create a machine that stamps a coin out of a sheet of steel, and that's what the machine does, if people complain about the diversity of the machine, I can take a black operator and put them in the seat to have them punch the button. The question is it going to replicate the exact same product? What we are, the crossroads we're standing at now is, how do we change the machine? How do we restructure everything? The question that I get from white allies, and I'm tough to use that word because I always say we're not individuals who are showing up for spiritual experiences, but we're spirits navigating the human experience, and the construct of race was put on us 400 or 500 years ago. Prior to that, it wasn't as important. But when we are in a space now where we are getting asked questions, the number one question I get asked now is, what can I do? What can I do? This adds another burden to black folk because it puts us in a position where our mission in life is to bring enlightenment to our white friends. So we got to pause our lives of dealing with everything we deal with to then help enlighten our white friends and take a chance that they're going to help us tear the system down. So I like to give people a few tangible things, get them to ask a couple of questions. So if you're taking notes, take a note. Ask yourself this: what kind of pictures are in your house? Who's hanging on the walls? Are they people who look just like you? Or are they a diverse array of people? One of the recommendations that Dr. Frances Cress Welsing gave to young black families was, go get pictures of the blackest people you can find, the blackest, most beautiful people you can find, and put them all over the walls so that your children, when they come home, can get a standard of beauty that looks like them, so that when they go out into the world, they can develop confidence. Ask, what extracurricular things are you doing to empower and encourage black children to have confidence in themselves and to have their voice? These are a couple of tangible things that we can do in an educational environment. And question yourself. If you're looking at a black kid on your right hand and a white kid on your left, and both of them have a spark, both of them have energy, what will make you decide that one is a problem and one is a hope for the future? Those are questions we can begin to ask ourselves.
So one of the things, and I'm actually getting ready to drop it in the chat right now. I had the privilege, and following up on what Jeff was just saying, I was reading the article that was brought to my attention on when we started talking about how do we change this narrative for our young people. There was a research study done on languages, and in this study, they had children, and the children were 5 to 7 years old, and they had on pair who they thought was a child's parent solely based upon the language that they spoke. So, and they looked at, Spanish, English, Hebrew. It was about 10 different languages. And if you read the article that I just put in there, it's interesting to see our young people, our youngest learners didn't necessarily match. And it was almost a 90% clip. Didn't match parents based upon race as far as color. They matched them strictly based upon language. So when we started talking about some of the systemic racism that our boys and girls experience, it's one of the things that we have to, when we talk about our own biases, all of these things are taught. So as educators, what are we going to do? How are we going to push the conversation? Since we know all behavior is learned behavior, what are we going to do to really begin to push this narrative forward?
And I think we had one question is, what are some ways we can teach our kids about whiteness and disrupting and dismantling whiteness and racism with our bio family and kids, not necessarily school kids? And I think, Jeff, you addressed a couple things, but when it's about teaching our own kids.
Yeah, I think that this is a very important question, again, because whenever we talk about issues of racism, I always have to turn things on their head and really come back to examining whiteness. That whole racial socialization piece is, the key to looking at how we will move forward throughout generations dealing with this issue of racism. White parents are going to have to start actively racially socializing their children and teach white history. And so when I say white history, I'm talking about teaching the things that have gotten us here, teaching about lynchings, about redlining, about the criminal justice system, and which means that they have to be educated themselves. But some of this is very clear cut, and the way that it's been framed has allowed for white people to be the winner when it comes to our history. We tell nice stories about, the courageous settlers who came to this land and were fearless and, somehow befriended indigenous people and had nice little get-togethers, and that's not the real history. And so that's going to be the best place to start. White parents are going to have to racially socialize their children around whiteness and teach real white history, and that means they have to know it. They're going to have to be actively engaged in understanding it so that they can then teach their children not to be colorblind, but to be aware of the transgressions of the past so that they can move forward with a clear understanding and change the narrative around race and racism in this country.
That's excellent. Those are really tangible things. Something I'm going to add is going to be on a very, very conversational point. What kind of conversations are you having when Black people aren't around? I think that is really what we get to. Are you willing to have the tough conversations when Black people aren't in the room? Because that's when you have a privilege. You have the privilege of not having to have Black people in the room. You have the privilege of thinking of a number of things. And in terms of what's happening now with the protests that came from Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and the latest round of police killings, it's an interesting phenomenon that happens. White allies will get woke, they'll make a donation, and then something else will come up in their lives and they go, oh, well, I did my part there. I showed up at the march, I made a donation. Let me turn back to this now. Nice, must be nice, as my wife says, must be nice. That's called privilege. You can turn away from it. You can choose to pick up race whenever you want to, and you can choose to put it down when it's uncomfortable. You got to move through the discomfort. Now, I'm not telling you to mess your family events up and to go around and ruin Thanksgiving and birthday parties and call granddaddy a white supremacist and storm out. I'm not
I'll
telling
tell
you to
the
do
story
that.
one day, Jeff, that happened, and I'll tell you later. It won't happen today, but later.
Right. That's a process. Some people are taking that, and the young people are doing that particularly. However, we have to also be mindful that the concept of, when we talk about terminology is important to me and words are important. I try my best not to be anti anything. I try to be pro something that gives us something that we can work toward, like gives us a good goal. If you're anti, then when it's gone, much of the time we find something else that we can be anti as opposed to pro. Pro is a very powerful prefix. So when we think about our kids, even for my white friends, my friends who just happen to be white, I always tell them, honesty is not hatred. It is psychological terrorism to know that Christopher Columbus was not an angel, but to then turn around and teach that he was. So you are then becoming more of the problem by thinking that you don't have an opportunity. Teaching the real history, teaching honest history allows you to weave into the core of the country that we live in the true stories that give people mutual respect. If you continue to be complicit in the whitewashing, even though your body does not vibrationally and align in a frequency with that truth, and you feel something and you know it's wrong and you continue to go forward, you are being complicit with passing on generational trauma and not fixing the system. If you are in the house and you have an opportunity to open and close the doors, you have a responsibility to do whatever is necessary to make people uncomfortable to make a change. Growth is about discomfort. I'm a 6'2" black man. If I tried to wear a size 5T children's pants, y'all would laugh at me silly if I showed up somewhere, and it would be extremely uncomfortable. Of course it would be uncomfortable because I've outgrown them. When you get to a place of discomfort in society, it's a sign that it's time for us to grow. When you're having those conversations with your kids, absolutely it should be uncomfortable, but guess what? We're all going to be better on the other side as a result of you being bold enough to do it.
So I'm a build on to that thought, Jeff. You hit a home run in my mind that had my mind running when you said what kind of conversations are we having, or some of our white colleagues are having when black folks are not around. I bring it back to even in education. What kind of conversations are we having when parents are not around? What kind of conversations are we having when children are not around? What kind of conversations are you having when you're just out with your friends, when your other colleagues are not around? Because those conversations impact how people view the work or view how boys and girls are coming through our educational system. And one of the quotes, and you know, I'm the big quote guy. And one of the things that rings to me, Dr. Martin Luther King stated, in the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So when we start really digging into that concept of that conversation that is happening when we're not around, this quote kind of just drives that home to me. Just for everyone that's on the call, Jeff wrote an amazing plan for the city of Nashville. And I'll put a Jeff, is it okay if I share the link with everyone?
Please, man. I meant to cover that. Mathew mentioned that, and I went down another space spiritually, and I didn't put it. But yeah,
no worries. I'm gonna share the link, but Jeff will be on News Channel 5 in about 10 minutes, sharing more about that information. So Jeff, before you get out of here, just as some closing thoughts or some recommendation to all of the educators on this line, just talk to them about some next steps that they can do to really begin. And one of the questions that jumped out was, how can we begin to dismantle this process in education? Everyone on this line is an unapologetic disruptor. So what are some next steps that we can do to continue to dismantle this in education?
I'm going to say first, thank y'all for giving me the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Sister Ingrid. Hey, it was a great run. I learned a lot about politics. That plan is at the Carr window. Forgive me for being so spot on with that, but it's 2 R's, thecarrwindow.com. And you can go see the Infinity Plan for Nashville. We'll talk about policing, talk about public schools, and how do we make a transition between virtual learning and in-place learning. We talk about COVID-19 and depoliticizing the money that's there. Also housing and innovative housing. I got a project that I'm working on that's exciting for creatives, artists, and teachers that's going to just be crowdfunded. Since you have to jump through so many hoops to get government to be with you, you can crowdfund things. I've done it before and it's going to work again. And of course, enabling Black voices in the arts. So when you get a chance, I invite you to read it and follow the recommendations. Call all of the people that we invite you to call at the end. All of that said, when we deal with kids, we often see them on an island far away, as if they are distant from us and they're not little bitty us's. Somebody asked me once, what's wrong with our kids? My wife was a former M&PS teacher. I taught theater at Pearl Cone for a semester. And I was in transition as an actor between here and New York. And I had a kid named Antonio who was in my class. And Antonio had to learn a monologue. And I gave him a monologue from a piece called Take a Giant Step. Here's a Black boy, Black young man who was in an acting class who'd never been given a monologue by a Black playwright at a Black school. So I gave him this monologue. He learned it. He was exceptional. It was wonderful. And when Gibbs talked about what is said behind students' backs, I remember being in the teacher's lounge. And one of the teachers who was just teaching, she reminded us she was just there until her husband got out of med school. And then she was going on. I was like, okay, that's nice. She said, oh, Antonio, you got him in your class. Oh boy, man, I feel for you. I said, why? She said, I know he's got to be something else. I said, he's got an A average in my class. And she acted astounded. When people say what's wrong with our kids, ask yourself the question, what's wrong with you? Why do we act out as grown-ups? We act out when we're not being heard. It's the same thing with kids. They act out when people are not feeding and pouring into them. One more thing and then I'm going so I can get to this, and I'm going to come back and watch the recording because I love the conversation. Everybody is just pouring in. Dr. Bruce Lipton, look it up, it's Lipton, not related, but like the tea. Dr. Bruce Lipton, as a cellular biologist and a long-time studier of cells, he said he recognized the power of nature versus nurture when he was working with cells. He would take healthy cells and put them in different dishes and they would grow because guess what? That's what cells do. Then he put them in a different environment. He said, let me take the same cells, put them in one dish, they became tissue. Put them in another dish, they became bone. The exact same cells. Guess what he learned from that? That all cells are the same. What makes the difference is the environment you put them in. So are you creating the environment? You might not be able to tear down the entire machine right now, but in your classroom, in your family unit, are you creating the environment to move away from a white supremacist structure into a space where we're all going to find equity? That's the question I'll leave y'all with. And I appreciate you all. I thank you for your listening and sharing and giving me an opportunity. I'd love to come back and hang anytime.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeff. We appreciate it. Ingrid, same to you. What do you say to this quote?
Well, I think what really stands out to me is how much, I guess, mental gymnastics people have to do to believe that racism is not really harming people of color, all people, and that we have to really, really push to have such a high level of tolerance for inequality and inequity in our surroundings. I say this as someone who, I did not grow up here in Nashville. I'm from Clarksville, Tennessee. And in Clarksville, Tennessee, there weren't as many schools. I'm telling my age, but when I was there, so long ago, all of the schools were the same. The buildings looked the same inside the buildings, the books, they were the same no matter what part of town. And I know this because my family, my aunts, my mom's sisters, they were all teachers. So I would be in there in the schools to visit them across the city. And all the schools were the same. And when I came to Nashville, and also when I went up north, I lived in Ohio for a little bit, Cleveland, and to see the differences, you know, from one side of town to the next, it was just, I was just surprised. There's so much inequity in our education that it's appalling. And people walk by it and drive by it every day. Extreme high tolerance for it. And at the end of the day, we'll then blame those who are on the bad end of things around issues of parenting and, you know, engagement and all these other things where they're really being held up to this standard that's impossible. Racism is creating a hostile environment that people are having to adapt to. So like Mr. Carr was saying, the environment is the issue. And instead of acknowledging the hostile environment of racism, we say, well, this is an issue of culture. This is an issue of genetics or dark skin. And even if we say it's culture, what we're saying is that people of color, their history is so entrenched in trauma that their trauma looks like culture to us. We say that, you know, their culture is X, Y, and Z when we talk about music or food or neighborhoods. But in actuality, these adaptations are not culture. They are trauma manifest through generations. And we're really going to have to reckon with our past and tell the truth in our history, tell the truth in our teaching, and hopefully get to a point of liberation, because in that truth telling, you know, people are setting themselves free. You know, it allows for retribution. It allows for us to move forward instead of staying in this place of, oh, is racism really happening? We can move on from there. It would be such a relief for everyone.
So as we began to put a wrap on everything, I've been watching the chat, and Rachel sent one of the last questions: how do we change the inequities our schools face? Rachel, I'll just tell you from my perspective as educators, and kind of like I just said, we yield huge power. And one of the things that I'll tell people as we're really trying to break down the systemic racism that we see, the inequities that our schools face, no one can be a louder voice than we are as educators. It is going to be incumbent of us to go forth in front of our elected politicians, get out in the community, and let everyone know the struggles and the inequities that our boys and girls face. Because when we don't voice our concerns, people begin to think, oh, those teachers can do it. So it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that we're putting that foot forward. That's why we always preach Disruptors Unite. There's power in numbers. If it's just me and Portell trying to get out there and tell this story, we're two people. They can dominate us really fast. But as a collective unit, if we come together, if all of the disruptors unite behind ensuring all of our boys and girls take part in a great educational system where they're taught truth, where they're bringing truth to power, and they're truly having the opportunity to really change their life through the power of a great education, that's how we break down the inequities in our educational system. That's how we're going to bring about change. And that's going to be what's needed for all of our disruptors to unite. Portell, if you want to close us out.
Well, first I'll say I don't know if they can shut us down, Ricki. I don't know. I think many people along the way have tried, and I'm not even talking about our current school. I think in life, a lot of people have tried to keep us quiet. I don't know if it's possible, but we will keep having this conversation. And the next conversation, we are going to talk to Judge Calloway. I'm working on a couple other people talking about the school to prison pipeline and the disproportional punishments of kids of color and how that prepares kids for the school to prison pipeline. That is going to be on July 23rd at 6:30. I was supposed to have a little graphic up, but I don't have it. So it will be on social media. We hope you all join. This is recorded. It will be on YouTube. I can't tell you when because I always have great intentions of getting it up quickly, and then it goes a week or so. So thank you all. Again, give us your feedback. Let us know what you want to talk about. Let us know what you thought. If you have questions, we'll continue to throw this up on social media. Ingrid, if people want to follow you on social media, where can they find you?
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm Aces Ingrid. That's my handle on Twitter and LinkedIn. Aces Ingrid.
And Jeff is Jeff. Do you know?
He's Rev Jock. So REVJOC. And for Jana, just so you know, for doing conversation 3, we're going to be talking about the school to prison pipeline. And I'll definitely share a story because one of my favorite teachers is a little white lady. She was 5'1", 110 pounds. She was my calculus teacher in high school, Paula Festa, and she did some life-changing stuff with me. And during that conversation, I'm gonna talk about how I was a child headed to prison, but she helped kind of make sure that I kept a certain mindset. So I'm gonna talk to during that next conversation. I'm gonna tell you about this little white lady that helped the 6 foot, 230 pound star football player in high school.
Thank you all. And again, please give us feedback. We really want to hear what you want to talk about and how to continue this conversation. Ricki and I are pretty much committed to just keep and have these conversations. And I do want to address why we've had people pay $5. We are paying the people who spoke today, by the way, but also it's because we had 300 people register at the first one, and then only about a third showed up, and there were people who wanted to. So it's just a commitment thing. We're not making any major money off of this by any means. We are just trying to get people that register actually show up for the conversation. So thank you all. We look forward to seeing you on the 23rd. If you work for Metro Schools, we got our news today. We can now start planning and being more effective around virtual learning. And if you're not with Metro Schools, we appreciate you all being here. I know we have people from Pennsylvania and Maryland and Michigan and all over the country. So thank you guys very much, and we'll see you on the 23rd.